The Trump administration defends its policy of letting federal agents wear masks during immigration raids, as Democrats in Congress and state capitals push for laws to restrict or even ban mask wearing by Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, and other agencies.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues, columnist Kim Strassel and editorial board member Mene Ukwe-Barua. Masked agents have been a striking feature of many of the photos and videos of President Trump's push to increase deportations. Democratic Senators Alex Padilla of California and Cory Booker of New Jersey have introduced legislation to ban mask wearing by federal agents at these agencies. Here is what Padilla is saying. When federal immigration agents show up and pull someone off the street in plain clothes with their face obscured and no visible identification, it only escalates tension and spreads fear while shielding federal agents from basic accountability, unquote. This is a months-long debate now as President Trump's immigration push has ramped up. Let's listen to Acting ICE Director Todd Lyons responding to some of these questions recently on CBS.
I'm not a proponent of the masks. However, if that's a tool that the men and women of ICE to keep themselves and their families safe, then I'll allow it. I do kind of push back on the criticism that they don't identify themselves. If you see a lot of the photos, like we were out that day, like I'll go back to our ride-along, men and women of ICE and our DOJ partners and local law enforcement do help us. They are identified on their vests. You can see the HSI, ERO, federal police officer, FBI on the back of the vest. So I would push back on the notion that we aren't identifying themselves. Now, what I would advocate for, and I've said this many times, is I know a lot of elected officials have put forward legislation or proposed legislation about banning of the masks, things like that. I would also want, elected officials to help us hold those people accountable that do dox or threaten an ICE officer or agent or their family. I think that's key. If we had that kind of support and had those laws or regulations in place that we can hold those folks accountable, to give ICE agents and officers and other law enforcement officers the peace of mind that someone that does threaten their life or their families or doxes them will be held accountable, I think that'd go a long way.
Kim, what do you make of this debate? One thing that I think is notable there is the acting ICE director very much sounds like he is not a fan of masking, and he really wishes his agents didn't feel like they had no choice but to do it.
Well, in a perfect world, obviously, yes, we would wish that no federal law enforcement, no state law enforcement were wearing a mask. It's good to be identifiable, especially if you are representing a position of authority. That being said, I think that there has been a lot of confusion about this and deliberate misdirection by a lot of Democrats on this issue. ICE agents, a lot of this is not new. ICE agents do not typically wear uniforms. Okay, that's been one of the criticisms. Oh, well, they're there in plain clothes. They don't wear uniforms. They don't have a standard uniform the way that police officers do. They do, as you just saw Lyons mention there, they do wear insignia that allows people to see that they are from an agency. If you listen to Democrats, that supposedly isn't enough. They should have to put forward their name or their badge number. But of course, the problem here is that they have been subject to attacks and their personal families have been subject to attacks. So that is the point of contention. ICE agents have also long worn masks because of dangers to them. Now, the use of that has certainly increased in recent months because of the growing attention that the press has put on this. So you're seeing them in a lot more photographs, and there's a lot more deportations and detentions being engaged in. And so you're seeing larger numbers of those agents out doing that. And so the prevalence of those masks might be greater. The background for this, obviously, too, is a huge and growing number of assaults on agents. DHS says that there have been 79 agent assaults from the time that Donald Trump took office until June 30th. That is compared to 10 in the corresponding period from a year earlier. So that's huge. And we've seen a growing, since 2018 in particular, organized militant activist groups who do make a priority out of finding out who agents are, putting their names and their personal information, where they live, who their family members are online, so that they can be intimidated and harassed. And a lot of Democrats don't seem to want to do anything about that problem.
Let's listen also to border czar Tom Homan, putting the onus for this problem on some of those groups and the Democrats, particularly, who are raising the temperature in this immigration debate.
I'm out on the streets every week with these teams, and yeah, they are masked, trying to protect their, themselves and their families because they're being doxxed. Their spouses are being doxxed. Their children are being doxxed. This modern technology, you can find out who everybody's family is. So they wear the mask in self-protection, but they do wear identifiers. I've never been in an operation, and I've seen any officer who hasn't got an HSI patch or an ERO patch, an ICE patch, an FBI, DEA patch. They all have patches. But the masks, I think, are important. How do we get rid of the mask? Stop the hateful rhetoric. Assaults on ICE officers are up over 800%. And I specifically mean members of Congress. If members of Congress can compare ICE to the Nazis, that gives some of those people on the far left that the out of control people. It emboldens them to take action. I'm just asking to let's stop the hateful rhetoric. And if you question what ICE does, then let's go to Congress and talk about the immigration law and what changes are needed. But again, they're simply enforcing the law that they're required to enforce and uphold the oath they took to enforce those laws.
Monet, I think he makes a fair point there on the point about these patches. I take it that HSI stands for Homeland Security Investigations. ERO stands for Enforcement Removal Operations. On the other hand, I would not blame members of the public if they see these agents out with those patches and they say HSI, ERO. I've never heard of those. I've heard of the FBI. I've heard of ICE. So, I mean, maybe there's a way to more clearly identify the agencies that these folks are coming from. But I think he's right that it would be helpful to turn down the temperature. You're hearing a lot of things thrown around, like the phrase secret police, which has pretty strong historical connotations. And the U.S. still is a country with the rule of law. There are always opportunities for abuses in law enforcement like anything else, but federal agents are generally, I think, good people who wake up and are doing their best every day to try to uphold the law, to try to follow the law. And this is still a country where a guy like Kilmar Armando Abrega Garcia, who is reportedly illegally in the country and who the government alleges is a member of the MS-13 and a human trafficker, this is still a country where a guy like that can win due process claims in federal courts, including at the Supreme Court.
Yeah, I think that we have seen it become a relatively mainstream position in the Democratic Party that not only do they oppose deportations, but that these deportation operations are the moral equivalent of war crimes, essentially. That ICE is operating as a kind of invader force violating the rights of these illegal immigrants who they believe are entitled to be able to stay in the country. And as a consequence of that, a lot of Democrats, and again, this isn't just the fringe, a lot even of elected Democratic officials believe that civil resistance against ICE at the bare minimum is warranted, and sometimes even direct confrontation, obstruction, and violence. The most visible example of this, obviously, is the clashes that we saw in Los Angeles, the riots that took place there, where you saw left-wing groups start to foment open resistance to ICE as they were going about deportation operations there, which resulted in President Trump bringing in the National Guard to quell those riots and allow ICE to resume its deportation activities. But you've also seen episodes like Brad Lander, who is the controller, the top financial officer in New York City, attempt to block an arrest being made by an ICE officer from taking place. He literally was holding the illegal immigrant who was being arrested as an officer was attempting to cuff him and bring him toward the elevator. He was obstructing that, and Lander was arrested for this. In New Jersey, you saw Congressman LaMonica McIver at an ICE detention facility in Newark, ended up being arrested for a scuffle that she engaged in with an ICE officer. And so this is going on regularly as a matter of course. And I think from the perspective of these ICE officers, they do have to think that we are being targeted, we're being observed. There are a lot of groups, and Tom Homan was referring to this, that spend a lot of time monitoring all of ICE's activities, trying to identify specific officers, posting their identities online. And the idea that they say that the main purpose of this is so that people can be aware and try to evade them, but it often shades into essentially saying that these people should be targets and potentially fomenting violence against these ICE officers. And so I think that the acting director in his remarks in that first clip was exactly right, that there need to be consequences for people who are known to be explicitly holding up these officers as targets and trying to make it easier to potentially assault them or obstruct them in their work. And until we have done more to secure their identities, I think it's going to be a hard sell for Republicans and for us specifically to say that we're not going to allow them to use masks to conceal their identities.
What about that point on consequences for people doing this? Senator Marsha Blackburn has a bill now that is in the Judiciary Committee. Relatively short. Here is the key sentence. Offense. It shall be unlawful to make the name of a federal law enforcement officer publicly available with the intent to obstruct a criminal investigation or immigration enforcement operation. Kim, I wonder what you make of that. I wonder if there would be any First Amendment concerns with that to criminalize the publication of names of federal agents who are out in public doing law enforcement operations in public often. Maybe the question, the legal question, rests on that intent prong, saying that it has to have the intent to obstruct a criminal investigation. But maybe what we need is more focus, more resources toward a protective mission and toward an investigative mission. If there are threats that are being made against federal agents, the government ought to take that seriously. And I know that there is always difficulty investigating every sort of claim that comes into a law enforcement agency. But it seems like that would be one that the Congress and the United States government should take seriously and maybe get some backing so that more of those threats can be investigated and the people who are making them can be brought to justice.
I think both of those are worthy ideas. And you might quibble with the specific language of Blackburn's legislation. But I think in my mind, it is a starting gun for Congress to begin thinking more seriously about security in a day and age where doxing is more prevalent, and how you balance those concerns of security and safety in mission with First Amendment and transparency questions as well, too. And that can be a very delicate balancing act, but we have also dealt with these issues in the past and managed to sort out some compromises via the courts and legislation that try to balance those interests. So it's at least a starting point, and I think something has to be done. It's really something in my mind that Democrats are out with legislation and their own laws, proposed legislation in Congress saying, we're simply going to ban this and we're not going to take into account any question of the security or safety of these agents or their spouses or their children. That's irresponsible too. I agree with Homan and Lyons that if there were some sort of legislation that imposed a penalty on folks who engage in such doxing, that you would go a long way toward potentially not needing the amount of masking that you're seeing at the moment, et cetera. But you're right, also potentially resources to go track this down, to let the ICE agents know that someone has their back and is engaged in their security. Hopefully some of that is happening already. But again, even if you do that, even if you find out who's engaged in this, if there is no way to hold those people engaged in the process responsible for anything, then it doesn't necessarily do a lot of good.
But the difficulty is, Monet, this doxing problem, I think, is a real one. And I do not want to understate the effect that has on people. The idea that the names of their kids, the names of their kids' schools, their house locations, and all of that stuff can be posted on the internet on a lot of these social media sites with intent to intimidate them and target them is a real problem. But I don't know quite how to resolve it. And it's a broad problem that applies beyond even just federal agents who are doing immigration raids. And the concern, I think, is whether this kind of mask wearing is going to spread or not, because there is a similar doxing threat against maybe state and local police officers who are out and about, maybe assisting with these immigration raids or just doing other law enforcement activities. There's been a lot of reporting on the threats that are coming into some judges, including federal judges. And yet, I don't think we want masking in public to become a new normal, because everyone is concerned that photos of them, because everyone has an iPhone now, are going to be circulating on the internet and people are going to be identifying them. I mean, we're not going to have immigration judges. Immigration judges are not going to take the bench in masks because they could be identified, and activist groups could try to intimidate them and go camp outside their homes, which, to be clear, it could happen. I mean, that's something that you could imagine one of these activist groups doing, is saying, we're not only going to try to intimidate these ICE agents, we're going to try to intimidate the immigration judges and make it so unpleasant to be an immigration judge in the United States that nobody's going to want to do that. And again, I'm not sure quite how to approach that problem, given the new internet realities that we're all living with.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can draw some distinctions here in terms of whether masks are appropriate for ICE versus other public officials and law enforcement officers. I do think that there is a difference between federal law enforcement and state and local law enforcement. Federal law enforcement tends to be for very specialized and very large cases that often have a higher degree of danger, and they are not expected to be integrated into their communities in the same way that a beat cop who belongs to a local police department would be. That person needs to be able to stand on the street corner and greet folks, do ordinary traffic stops, shake hands, resolve low-level disputes. It's extremely important for his job and for the trust of the community that he be visible, identifiable, ideally even lives close by to where he's working. And so masks would not make sense, even though police officers do face threats of that kind. Masks wouldn't be appropriate for state and local law enforcement, as opposed to federal law enforcement, where they are acting on specific orders to go to a place and apprehend a specific criminal, but aren't really integrated into the community in that way. I think they're also very different from judges, for example. A judge is someone who is taking public office, not just a government role like a law enforcement officer is, but really a public office, affixing their name to orders, passing sentences, conducting business in public, and they, of course, need to be identifiable as well. And that is not exactly true of law enforcement officers. When they sign up for the job, they're not necessarily putting their name out there and attaching that to their authority. They're more an agent of an office that they serve. They're not supposed to be individually visible and involved in that way. But I do think in terms of the risk of something like the Blackburn bill, where you potentially criminalizing people from publicizing the identity of someone, the real key language that she includes is if it's with the intent to potentially target that person or to do something that could cause them to be harmed. And I think that any judge who was interpreting a charge of that kind that was brought would have to interpret that very narrowly and basically say, it can't just be that you posted a picture of an ICE agent on a website and said, hey, here's ICE, they're downtown in Chicago, and somebody identifies that person and says, I know this guy. It would have to be more specifically like some of these Antifa-related websites that are essentially saying, this person should be a target for attack and are talking to themselves about how they can obstruct ICE activities and potentially using direct violence. And so that one kind of comes down to how that law is put into force, how it's enforced. And I think that there isn't really a civil liberty problem as long as it's only being used to penalize people who are directly advocating violence or obstruction.
Kim, what about the potential downsides? I mean, it sounds like you are siding on the side of Lyons and Homan here. And I feel a bit conflicted because, again, I take seriously the concern about this doxing threat. On the other hand, I do worry that there's something corrosive to public trust and public confidence in these agencies if it becomes routine to have masking of law enforcement officers and federal agents. And then there are also questions about accountability and incentives. I mean, the argument that Republicans, including President Trump, have made against masked protesters, for example, is that it provides a sense of impunity. If there's a crowd of people who are all masked, they're maybe going to behave a little bit differently than if they all have their faces showing in public. And I think that has been some of the experience of the debate over body cameras, for example, in local law enforcement situations in the past several years. I mean, again, obviously, we have to speak in generalities if we're talking about law enforcement writ large, but it is not hard to imagine that an officer who knows he's wearing a body camera and not wearing a mask might behave a little bit more politely, have a different approach toward the public in some situations than an officer who is not on a body camera and is in a mask.
Possibly, although I like to begin from the supposition that most of these people go into their jobs because they are honorable and decent and want to do the right thing most of the time. Are there some bad apples in some places? Yes, although I do think that one of the problems of our debate over law enforcement in general over the past 6, 7, 8 years has been that we don't make that distinction and we throw everybody and lump everybody into the same category because of those few bad apples, and that we are making laws and policies on the basis of the few bad apples, and that those are harming in indirect ways the mission and the work of the 95% of those that do go into this job for the right reasons and do behave properly and correctly. As noted at the beginning of this program, in an ideal world, no, there would be no masks. I just think it's extremely important in the context of this debate to understand why they're being used and to point the finger at the right culprits and to make sure that the burden of this corrosive debate we're having at the moment and this unpleasant situation in which it's become routine for our members of Congress to throw shade on our law enforcement community and suggest they act with bad motives, and a community in which doxing is now prevalent and organized resistance to law enforcement is now routine, that we point the fingers at those folks for creating the environment that is now making many agents feel as that their own personal safety and that of their family can only be maintained by having some level of anonymity. I think it's very important too, I'll just throw in here what Tom Homan said. These are not people who are making independent judgments. They are not creating the immigration laws. They came and they're being given orders. Your job today is to go pick up so-and-so in this place. That is what they are doing. And to have their livelihoods and again their personal safety at risk for simply doing what is being asked of them, by the way, fundamentally being asked by them in the end by the very lawmakers now criticizing them, because those are the lawmakers that passed our immigration laws and aren't changing our immigration laws in any way, I think is a bit much. So for the moment, yeah, I'm very much on the side of those that feel that they need to continue wearing the mask. I'd love to see a situation where it weren't that way. But that's going to take a lot more positive leadership from our elected leaders than we are seeing right now in Congress.
Thank you, Kim and Monet. Thank you all for listening. You can send us emails, anonymously or not, to pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back next week with another edition of Potomac Watch.